Kia ora koutou katoa. I'm Francesca from Charities Services. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for this webinar on preventing terrorism financing. This is the second webinar in our lunchtime webinar series for 2019. To find out when the next webinar is, please do sign up for our newsletter on our website. That's www.charities.govt.nz, or sign up to the Charity Services Facebook page so you know when they're coming up. Any resources that we mention today will be included in an email that we will send out to you tomorrow. I'm now going to introduce our presenters. Today we have Andrew Hill from the Ministry of Justice. Andrew leads New Zealand's work with the Financial Action Task Force and other international anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing work. We also have Detective Inspector Christian Bernard. He is the head of the Financial Intelligence Unit within the police. And we have Aaron Davey. He's from the Council for International Development, and he coordinates a humanitarian network and code of conduct. I'm now going to hand you over to Andrew Hill.
Kia ora tātou everyone, and thank you to the Department of Internal Affairs for hosting us this afternoon, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm going to run through some basic information about what terrorism financing is and what our international obligations are before I hand over to my colleagues to discuss some more practical matters. So if we go to our first slide. So I'm going to run over some common myths about terrorism financing. So first of all, there's a common misconception that terrorism financing is complicated or exotic. As I think we'll see in some of our case studies, the methods which terrorists use to fund operations can be very ordinary and everyday. I also hear quite often that terrorism financing is something that doesn't happen in New Zealand and can't happen in New Zealand. But again, when we look at some of the risk factors, I think we'll see that it's something that could quite easily occur here. Similarly, I hear quite often that terrorism financing isn't particularly serious. Again, terrorism financing is something which terrorists rely on to commit terrorist acts, and without terrorism financing, terrorism couldn't occur. So it is a very serious matter. By contrast, there's often a perception that if it is that serious, that only really bad people are involved. Unfortunately, this isn't the case, and people can easily, unwittingly, be involved in terrorism financing if they're not aware. And finally, terrorism financing is something that everybody has a responsibility to try and prevent. And in particular, it's important to understand that we all have a different piece of the puzzle which is required to stop terrorism financing. So what is terrorism financing? Well, generally, we break terrorism financing down to three phases. Firstly, terrorists or terrorist supporters raise funds, and they'll collect money any way possible to further their terrorist activities. That could be through crime like fraud or drug dealing. It could be through normal income like diverting the wages that the terrorist earns to terrorist activity. Or, as particularly relevant to this discussion, it could be raised from donations to a charity or for the terrorist organisation itself. The second phase is moving the money. Terrorists need to move the money from the place that they've collected it to the place they need to use it. That could involve moving it offshore, or it could involve moving it domestically. It's very common for terrorists to use traditional methods like carrying cash to do this. They can also use other techniques to hide transactions from authorities, like mixing the money they've collected in a business or in a non-profit organisation. And finally, terrorists need to use the funds. So obviously, they can use those funds to fund attacks, but they could also use it to train, to recruit, to travel, or to fund ongoing operations by the organisation. So to try and stop this occurring at a global level, countries have formed a group called the Financial Action Task Force, which aims to prevent money laundering and terrorism financing. Now, of particular relevance to this discussion, New Zealand, like every country, is required to understand our terrorism financing risks and prevent terrorism financing through applying targeted financial sanctions against terrorist groups and entities, and prevent terrorists from abusing non-profit organisations. And should terrorism financing occur in New Zealand, we are obliged to investigate and prosecute that activity. Now, my particular job is to lead our engagement with the Financial Action Task Force and the lead up to an international evaluation by that group. And when we are assessed next year, we will be obliged to show that we apply a focused and proportionate measures to non-profit organisations who are vulnerable to terrorism financing abuse. Importantly, the FATF makes a distinction that we need to ensure that we don't disrupt or discourage legitimate NGO activities. So that's about it for the background to terrorism financing, and I'll hand over to my friend and colleague, Christian Barnard from the Police Financial Intelligence Unit.
Hello, Christian Barnard here from the Financial Intelligence Unit. The unit that I manage is involved with the collection of suspicious activity and transaction reports from our financial sector. Out of that, we do look for indicators of terrorist financing. Such reports are then referred for further analysis or to other organisations within the government for further investigation. In terms of how MPOs can be abused for terrorism purposes, there has been research that's been undertaken by the Financial Action Task Force in relation to a number of incidents where an abuse of a charity has been identified for terrorist purposes. There is a link at the end of this presentation to a 2016 report by the Financial Action Task Force that examines terrorist financing and how it can be in its links, or how it can be linked into charities and not-for-profits. The most common method is diversion of funds, and that's either by people inside a not-for-profit or people external to the organisation, such as offshore partners. Now, the funds that are diverted can then subsequently be used for a range of purposes. And where you have instances where MPOs or the directing officials maintain an affiliation with a terrorist entity, it raises the risk of those funds being used for a range of different reasons. Some of these reasons include providing support to the recruitment of terrorist entities or terrorists, and that could be where, if some examples might be where money is diverted into literature that can be used to rally further support and targeted recruitment for the organisation, or it could be to fund logistics and travel for new recruits into a conflict zone. Abusive programming is also a commonly identified problem where legitimate donations are abused at the point of delivery. And that is where money or items that are intended to be used for the purposes of the charity are diverted to the terrorist entity, and for example, food or clothing that could then end up being used by the terrorist organisations rather than the intended recipients. Some terrorist entities abuse the NPO sector through false representation, where they simply start a sham charity in order to deceive the donors into providing support. As a charity or an NPO, it's very important that you understand the risk. And by understanding the risk enables you to make decisions about which organisations and people you will choose to engage with and network with as part of your provision of donations. Now, the risk is primarily determined by the value of the NPO's resources or activities to the terrorist entities. There are some activities undertaken by NPOs that are not immediately valuable, particularly where you're looking at cultural support or sporting support. These are not typically the types of outcomes that terrorist organisations are going to be interested in. The other significant risk is the NPO's activity and its proximity to an active terrorist threats, particularly when we are looking at our high-risk jurisdictions internationally. There are a number of jurisdictions where there are immediate threats where NPOs are operating, and it does increase the risk of abuse of NPOs. So in terms of understanding the risk, and as it relates to New Zealand-based charities, the most significant risk is abusive programming. And we see some very high-risk areas within service activities such as housing, social services, education, or healthcare. So these are service activities that have been identified as being high risk to abuse by terrorist organisations. So low risk areas are expressive activities such as sports and recreation, arts and culture, interest representation or advocacy. In terms of the high risk jurisdictions, there are high risk populations of those where there is a correlation between terrorist movements and the population being targeted by the NPO. The high-risk jurisdictions are identified as being where there is where there is conflict or low governance, and this brings a risk of corruption. When you are operating your NPO, your risks will increase in situations where your NPO uses alternative remittance services and/or cash. The use of alternative remittance services and cash makes it challenging for it to be audited and traced, and from a perspective of you undertaking any due diligence, it does make it more difficult. When your NPO engages with other individuals or organisations who deliver aid without conducting a screening process. So by this is that you need to ensure that you conduct customer due diligence or due diligence at each point that the aid or donations are touching upon within your network, so that you are satisfied that the aid or donations are being delivered to the right people. Your NPO is not able to provide, another risk is where your NPO is not able to provide direct oversight of programming or projects you are funding. And that is common in New Zealand because New Zealand charities are very reliant on overseas partners to undertake the disbursement or provide the donations or goods to the intended recipients. It is also important that while you need to undertake your due diligence at the outset, this is a requirement that should be ongoing, particularly as different people move in and out of the organisations that you are dealing with. And you need to undertake ongoing risk assessments and due diligence to make sure that you are satisfied that the donations and that you are collecting are reaching their are being used for their intended purpose. In terms of your due diligence, some red flags that you need to be looking out for is activity that is inconsistent with the NPO's operations. So if you observe financial transactions where they lack any logical purpose, or there seems to be no link between the stated activity of the organisation and the parties in relation to the transaction. So if you have a situation where transactions are being undertaken that seem nonsensical, do not align with what your expectations are, that should be a red flag. Where you observe fund transfers that are structured, or as referred to in the financial circles as being smurfed, where you see a large number of donations made by fund transfers but are ordered in small amounts in efforts to avoid triggering what in New Zealand is referred to the AML CFT requirements, which is the anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism requirements, or where you see foreign exchange transactions performed on behalf of donors or beneficiaries, followed by funds transfers to locations having no apparent connection with the donors or beneficiaries or to high-risk areas. So in short, if you observe transactions being made with your donations subsequent to them being collected, which appear to be done in an effort to prevent detection by the authorities, that also is a red flag. It can be consistent with the use of alternative remittance providers, which is why the use of alternative remittance providers in themselves can be high risk. I'm now going to hand you over to Aaron Davey from the Council of Human Development. No, sorry, Council of International Development.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. I'm Aaron Davey from the Council for International Development, and it's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. One of the things that I want to talk about really is just an example within the NGO sector of accountability mechanism which can sort of support NGOs working overseas. In this regards, it was really interesting to hear the discussion and reference to remittances, because as we know, the level of remittances, even in response to emergency responses overseas, is quite often far greater than what's going officially through NGO channels as well. Anyway, I'd like to first of all just mention the Council for International Development's Code of Conduct. And this Code of Conduct, or the Code as we refer to it, is a voluntary self-regulatory sector code of good practice which aims to improve international development outcomes and increase stakeholder trust by, and helping organisations with overseas activities to enhance their transparency and accountability. So it very much serves as a guide to both good practice and a risk management document. Interestingly, within this code, which has been in place for about 3 years now, there is there's a number of mandatory obligations, and one of these is the principle of control of funds and resources overseas. But very much the code also has obligations and best practice for NGOs around recruitment, partnering in the field, and all of these things working together can ensure that any organisation is having a greater risk management framework around managing funds overseas. On the topic of partnering with organisations overseas, there's a number of things that organisations should be aware of. That's including things like considering that those that you're partnering with are registered charities in their own territories, that their documentation clearly expresses a clear mandate, and that is reflected in their documentation, and also ensuring that you cite adequate governance and accountability policies as well. One of the topical issues which I know many of you are thinking about at this point is the question of localization, which is very much on the agenda of many organizations working overseas. And localization really is, in many ways, is the deference is perhaps not the right word to use, but it's about strengthening the local capacity of our partners around, well, strengthening the local capacity of partners as well as institutes, so that they can practice a greater level of accountability, perhaps doing some of the monitoring and evaluation and reporting on the activities themselves, and also in many ways deferring decision making to them as well. And the localization agenda, particularly in development and emergency response overseas, is an interesting one in this conversation, because at the same time that we are seeing an increase in obviously very necessary legislative burden, NGOs are exploring ways to build trust and in some ways delegate authority and decision making offshore. So it's a very exciting time in that regards. I just want to quickly speak to about the code, and I think what I'll perhaps do is provide my colleagues with a copy of this code to include in the resources for your reference. It's quite a substantial document. It's about 42 pages and over 120 obligations for organisations working overseas. But I just want to point out some of the requirements of this code. It requires that all organisations have the capacity to track donor funds that have been raised for particular purposes, and you need to be able to demonstrate how you track and manage these funds overseas. Obviously, one of the key obligations within the code is that that the funds and resources will be dispersed and managed overseas in accordance with all relevant laws in New Zealand. And this includes all laws around taxation, counter-terrorism financing, and anti-money laundering legislation as well. So the code is a very good measure to see how your organisation is doing against best practice as well. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, I just want to very quickly go back to the previous slide. Okay, so just want to very quickly talk about risk assessments and reporting procedures. I mean, it is important to acknowledge that civil society and NGOs are, particularly those well-known ones, it's a mature sector that is well-versed in effective management and funds overseas, but in a ever changing landscape with increasing complexity, it's important for us all to stay abreast of developments. So just very quickly and briefly talking about risk assessments and reporting procedures. It's one of the important things is to make sure that you're aware of lists from your respective departments of foreign affairs and trade around what we call prescribed terrorist organizations, so that you're not inadvertently or indirectly funding them. Our code requires that all contracts should have specific reporting clauses detailing the proposed use of funds and budgets. And your policies around reporting should include provisions that deal with how funding resources will be provided to partners in the field, timing and method of disbursements, the application of interest and exchange rate movements, but along with accountability around how those funds are accounted for, including the use of third parties in the field as well. Most of this would become clear from reading the code as well. And on that note, I think I will probably move on and back to my colleague. Yep, Andrew.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to Christian before that as well. Hopefully, some really useful information for people from those two presentations. I'm going to look at a couple of real-life case studies. Neither of these are from New Zealand, but I've chosen these two case studies because these are the types of activities which could quite easily happen in New Zealand. So in the first case, a large MPO overseas was providing disaster assistance in an area where a terrorist organisation was active. Now, what the MPO was doing was delivering cash payments through a local money service provider to beneficiaries. Sometime later, one of the MPO's partner organisations, investigated that MPO's activities and found that the local money service provider was taking a tax from those payments and passing that to the terrorist organisation. And in other instances, the beneficiaries themselves were being quote unquote taxed by the terrorist organisation, meaning that the non-profit organisation was inadvertently supporting the terrorist organisation's activity, and also the beneficiaries weren't getting the full benefit of the aid that should have been reaching them. So just considering the points that Christian talked about, and also the advice that Aaron gave us, you can see that there's a few red flags that the MPO could have been aware of. Firstly, they're providing assistance to a conflict zone. They're using alternative remittance and cash. It seems that the relationships that they had were new, and so they weren't fully able to trust the people they were working with locally, and they didn't maintain oversight of how the money was actually spent. More positively, they did have a partner in the area who was able to provide some of that oversight, and perhaps they could have relied on them more at the beginning of the process. I think if we were to engage in this type of activity and refer to the code of practice that Aaron described, I think a lot of the mistakes could have been avoided. In the second case, in the UK, two men volunteered to collect for a charity. They collected for one day, but they held on to the collection bucket and vests and continued to collect money from the public. They used that money that they collected to travel overseas to take part in terrorist training, terrorist videos, and prepare to conduct a terrorist attack in the UK. Luckily, they were later arrested for the terrorist plot before it could take place. Now, I understand the next session in the series will look at NPOs protecting themselves from fraud. So I think hopefully there will be some really useful lessons from that session, which could help prevent this type of activity. But suffice to say that this is an example of how protecting New Zealand from terrorist financing risks can also help to prevent non-profit organisations from being victimised. So at this point, I'm going to hand back to Christian to talk a little bit more about some of the practical steps and issues that NPOs can be aware of. But I would like to ask for any questions. You can type them in through the webinar interface, and we'll address those as best we can at the end of the session. Christian.
Thanks, Andrew. From a practical perspective, it is very important that you undertake due diligence, not just with the first part that of the network that you're using, but it's knowing about where the money is going every step of the way, and having an understanding of the organisations that are delivering the donations on behalf of your NPO. In the financial world, it's known as KYC, or Know Your Customer. And it is, you need to make sure that you are asking yourself a series of questions when you're dealing with an NPO that's foreign, that will be acting on your behalf. They need to be trustworthy. And do you really know them? Undertake research on the internet, or ask them questions and review their governance documents. Where you can, seek to verify documents and identities. Check to ensure that the NPOs that you're dealing with are not on sanctions lists, and you'll find a link to the New Zealand sanction lists at the end of this presentation. You need to know where your money is going. Don't start sending donations until you've completed your due diligence. Ensure that you use formal financial mechanisms such as banks, or if you are going to undertake remittance activities, use reputable remittance agencies rather than informal methods of moving funds overseas. Ensure that you are getting a paper trail, obtaining receipts where you can, or documentation about the movement of the money. You need to understand the route that the money will take, and you need to be satisfied that sufficient due diligence is completed at every step along the way until the money reaches its intended destination. If you're in doubt, if your risk assessment does raise any doubts about the identity of the group or people that you're dealing with, what their actual intentions are, or if there are any indicators that suggest something nefarious is occurring, do not establish or continue a relationship with the organisation, and seek out an alternative. So here is a list of further reading that's been referred to throughout the discussion today. And I just want to also further reiterate if there is any questions that anyone may have, if you'd like to put them down, we'll endeavour to answer them. So the question there is, are there any instances of NPOs in New Zealand receiving donations from global terrorist sources? If so, how do the terrorist sources then get the money out of the MPO? That is not a commonly recognised typology, primarily because of the risks associated with moving money through a highly regulated jurisdiction. What we tend to observe in the New Zealand context is money that is ultimately destined for a terrorist organisation being collected here and sent offshore where due diligence hasn't been undertaken. The other type of movements of money that we see in relation to terrorists, and it was particularly prevalent with ISIL, was terrorists, New Zealanders who were what we refer to as foreign terrorist fighters. So they were New Zealand citizens who were prepared to travel and fight on either for ISIL or for another one of the groups that were fighting in Syria or in the surrounding area, and they would remit funds through charities in order to facilitate, as a way of facilitating getting the money to the jurisdiction that they were heading to. The next question there is, are there any New Zealand case studies? We probably can't speak too generally about specific New Zealand case studies. Apart from I can probably only comment on the general typology which I've just discussed. So that looks like it's a question. That's a question for Aaron. So is that also focus?
So this is Andrew again. So we have a question: explain focused and proportionate measures for MPOs. So this is quite a technical question. Unfortunately, it is a very good question. What the FATF expects is that countries assess risks at a national level, so we understand which MPOs are most vulnerable to terrorism financing and what types of terrorism financing risks they are exposed to. And then from that, the measures should be focused on those risks. So in a New Zealand context, we have identified that our primary risks relate to raising and moving funds offshore to support offshore terrorism. And in particular, that this might be done without the MPO being actively engaged, and they might be unwittingly abused. So that's why a lot of the discussion today has been focused on that type of risk. Proportionate, the measures which we've introduced should be proportionate in that they should be sufficient to meet that risk. And so the work that the Charities service does, for example, is again designed to be sufficient to prevent that type of risk, but it shouldn't be so great as to make it impossible for MPOs to move funds offshore to assist people in need. So hopefully that explains what the FATF is talking about. And we have a question for Aaron.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. Just in response to the question there about who are the members of SID in New Zealand and what are the benefits to charities who may want to join SID. SID has a membership of about 37 organisations at this point. The easiest thing for me to say is really to refer you to our website, which is www.cid.org.nz, and you'll see there that the membership list ranges from Oxfam, Tear Fund, Save the Children, World Vision, and right through to other organisations like Christian Blind Mission, Christian World Service. So there's a real mixture of members. One of the benefits to charities or organisations that have development or humanitarian activities overseas is by joining CID, you can go through the compliance process to become what we call to gain code signatory status with our code, and that's a process that takes 2 years, and it's really like a quality mark to ensure that you do a quality mark that also tells the public that you prescribe to best practice and the highest levels of accountability that you can. It's increasingly important for organisations to be part of a sort of critical mass so that we can communicate to other stakeholders key issues that we can collectively communicate key issues that we can communicate those to our stakeholders, and also as part of a critical mass, we can sort of influence policy as well. Just while I have the microphone, I also just want to mention around some of the stuff, particularly in regards to the case study around fundraising. In terms of ensuring you are protecting yourself against misuse of funds, it would be really important to also look at the many codes and standards promoted by the New Zealand Fundraising Institute as well, and many of the members of CID would also be registered with the Fundraising Institute in New Zealand as well. Anyone else?
Well, we don't see any more questions at this time, so it leaves it to me to wrap up. So just like to thank everybody listening in today. Thank you to Christian and Aaron for joining me to talk about terrorism financing, and thank you to the department for hosting the event. I really do hope it has been of use to everybody listening. You'll get an email which will link to this webinar so that you can listen again. Also, you'll get a link to the resources which have been mentioned as well. And finally, you'll see on the slide, but I think in the email that you'll receive as well, an email address, events@charities.govt.nz, which you can use to contact us with any further questions that you might have. So with that, thank you to everybody again, and please tune in next month for the fraud awareness session. Thank you. Goodbye.